Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. You know, a viewer asked me the other day, why do Americans use so much water in cooking potatoes? And I didn't have an answer. Because really, there is no reason. So I decided to show you a different way. These delicious potatoes are braised and they're baconed and they're browned, but they're not boiled. And you know, there's really no reason for all that water. Save the water, save the nutrition, save the flavor. Before we start cooking, if you like our videos, give us a thumbs up. If you want to notice when I post new videos, subscribe and click the little bell at the top right. Now let's make some potatoes. I like this with red potatoes, but you can use regular potatoes if you'd prefer. I'm going to use almost the whole stick of butter. I've got a couple little green onions here, about a 1/4 cup of broth, chicken or beef, beef's better, and some grated cheese. No, it's a myth that it's bad for you and won't melt. It's fine if you have arthritis. I washed and peeled the potatoes and cut them into medium small pieces because these are going to cook slow. Now we're going to do this whole thing right here in this little 9-inch Wagner skillet. Isn't she pretty? And I'm going to melt half stick of the butter on low heat. And during this whole process, we will never get above low heat. So once it gets almost melted and I get just a tiny bit of bubbling, I'm going to put the potatoes in. And I missed one here, so I'm going to cut it now. If you have a bigger family, you of course want to use a bigger skillet, but try to use the smallest skillet that will hold the potatoes you're going to cook. These are going to go into the oven at the end, and we want the final product to be thick enough to keep its texture. And I'll explain when I said low heat, I mean low heat. This is on 2 out of 9. This is a high BTU burner, but that's still a low heat. The seasoning here is really simple. I used a 1/2 teaspoon of salt here, and you'll taste at the end and add more if you need. Then I'm going to use some thyme, and of course that's optional, but thyme goes really well with potatoes. That was a 1/4 teaspoonful. And then I'm going to add a 1/4 teaspoonful of garlic powder. I'm not adding pepper today, but you probably want to add some freshly ground black pepper. So I'm going to stir these around just to make sure that the butter gets all over them. And you can see I have just a tiny little bit of steam going. But again, low heat. And the reason for the low heat is we don't want to brown these potatoes. We're braising them. They'll have the texture of those great potatoes you cook with your pot roast. Now I'm adding a 1/4 cup of the chicken broth. I really prefer beef broth in this dish, but you know, go with what you got. So we're going to let this simmer on this low heat until we start getting some steam. Just a little bit of steam, you'll see it. And then we're going to cover this. I'm going to set my timer for 30 minutes and we're going to let these braise. And 30 minutes of braising is enough if you've cut these small enough, but test it. Make sure they're done all the way through. Nobody wants a hard potato. And the spoon goes right through these. Now you see this fluid, this liquid that we've got down here. We want to cook a little bit of that out because we don't want the potatoes soupy and we don't want any browning. So on this low heat, I'm just going to let this sit here and simmer to evaporate some of that liquid. And you know, you can always add some back if you evaporate too much of it. So you can see that what's down in here now is mostly butter and flavor. And so I'm going to mash these. Now I'm going to mash them right in the pan with my potato masher. If you want to pour them out into a bowl to mash them, you can do that. But I didn't want to mess up another bowl. So I'm just going to mash them right here. And I'm not going for a really smooth, thin texture. I want these to be sturdy, to stand up. They're going to have just a few little chunks still in them. fully cooked soft chunks, but still a little bit rougher texture than I normally would make mashed potatoes. Now I've put almost the other half stick of butter in here, and then I'm going to mash that just a little bit more, you know, because you can't have too much butter. You know, truth is, potatoes are fairly bland, and most of the flavor comes from butter and salt and whatever else you add. So you can see the texture I have here, and I'm thinking this is a little bit too thick. So I'm going to put just a little bit of chicken broth, about 2 tablespoons full. I don't want them thin, but this is a little bit stiffer than I want them. So I figure about 2 tablespoons full of chicken broth will finish this up. And I'm just going to stir it around with a fork. That's about 2 tablespoons. No, I didn't measure it. And just stir that around with a fork to get it mixed in. They're going in the oven, and I don't want them to be dry. So when I get them stirred up with the fork, I'm going to kind of flatten them out in the pan. And yes, I need a little bit more salt. So that all has to be mixed in too. You didn't see me taste it, but I did taste it. And it needed a little bit more salt. So we'll just mix that in. And you know, these look really good. When you bite into them, you will taste potato. So kind of flatten them out and clean up the sides of the pan, because this is going in the oven and you don't want that to bake onto the side of your pan. There you go. Now you see, I was going for the thickness here. That's why I used the smaller pan. And we're ready for our potato toppers. This is 3 strips of bacon, not cooked quite done, because we're going to brown it under the oven. I don't want to burn them. And we'll just spread that out. And I'm using 3 strips. You can use 6. You can use as much bacon as you want to. And I've chopped up those little green onions and left some of the green in there. Spread them out over the top. You know, these are going to be like, they're going to taste like your loaded baked potato. Have that same texture. And then the cheese. And yes, I'm using pre-grated cheese. This is one of the things I say all the time. The stuff you hear about grated cheese, it's true, there is cellulose in the cheese, but cellulose occurs in, there's cellulose in the onions, and there's cellulose in your lettuce. I just think there's too much really bad stuff in processed food for me to worry about some unnaturally occurring product like cellulose. But I will say, if you want to grate up some Gruyere and some cheddar, you won't be sorry. So these go into the oven under the broiler, and this is what you get. And you can serve this at table right in this pretty little pan, or use any pan you like. I just prefer cast iron always. So I've plated this up. I want you to look at these potatoes. Is that gorgeous or what? And I think cooked this way, without all the water, they're a little more flavorful. I know they're more nutritious. This is my plate. I've got some salmon and some tomatoes and a slice of avocado. Potatoes are high carb. A cup of this is 32 grams of carbs, and I have less than a cup here. But I eat 50 grams of carbs a day. That's healthy for me. And so I have to keep everything else really low carb here. But, oh, you know, these are so good. Of course, you know, cheese and onions and bacon and the texture of baked potato. I'm going to try this little salmon. I have a video on how I cook salmon. I glaze it with sugar-free fruit preserves. This time it was blackberry. So good. I always encourage folks to eat lighter on the carbs, even if you're not diabetic, and I am diabetic. So if I'm going to spend my carbs on something, I want it to have as much flavor as possible. So I really, really hope you try this, and I hope you like it as much as I do. And I hope to see you again tomorrow on Debbie's Back Porch.